Welcome everyone to the BBEST-Biofuture webinar. This is an activity jointly organized by the 4th Brazilian Bioenergy Science and Technology Conference and 2nd Biofuture Summit. I'm Glaucia Souza, moderator of this webinar activities, coordinator of the FAPESP BIOEN program, and professor at the University of São Paulo. My background is in biochemistry and biotechnology, and I participate and sometimes lead assessing bioenergy sustainability. I participate in several national and international initiatives to disseminate knowledge and advise policy, including the International Energy Agency, the Global Bioenergy Partnership GBEP, the Biofuture Platform, the Scientific Committee on Problems of the Environment scope, the World Bioenergy Association, and the Federation of Industries of the State of São Paulo, FAPESP. I'd like to start by thanking the Biofuture Platform, BIOEN, SBBQ, BBEST, SBE, and MFA teams that helped put together this webinar series in preparation for the upcoming BBEST-Biofuture conference. I would also like to thank our supporters: FAPESP, University of São Paulo, University of Campinas, Agronomic Institute of Campinas, CNPEM, the Brazilian government, International Energy Agency, and the Brazilian Trade and Investment Promotion Agency, APEX. Okay, the idea of this first webinar is to kick off the discussions we intend to have during the conference. We chose to discuss today the way to post-COVID economic recovery, the way to do this sustainably with bio. Our economy has slowed down, but climate change has not. We need to ramp up our efforts and increase the production of biofuels to meet our GHG emissions targets. We don't want to reset our economies with larger emissions. We can't. Our panelists will present the status of bioenergy science, technology, and policies in Brazil and how they could bring back our economy better and cleaner so that we are able to say we are environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable. I will introduce now our distinguished panelists. Thank you very much for being here with us. Renato Godinho, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He has an expertise in international policy dialogue and cooperation for the clean energy transition. He has an undergraduate degree in journalism and communications, a master's degree in international diplomacy, and has a career in diplomacy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Brazil. He was a leader proponent of the Biofuture Platform in COP22, and he now acts as its first chairperson. Plinio Nastari, founder and president of DATAGRO, Brazil's leading consulting company on sugar and ethanol market analysis. He has a master and PhD degrees in agricultural economics from Iowa State University and was a professor of economics at Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Dr. Nastari was also a member of technical committees in the National Energy Commission, Commission for the Re-Exam of the Energy Matrix, and Interministerial Council on Sugar and Ethanol. He was a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC AR2. Carlos Henrique de Brito Cruz. Brito Cruz is a professor at the Physics Institute at UNICAMP. He directed the Physics Institute at UNICAMP, was the VP of Research at UNICAMP, president of the São Paulo Research Foundation, FAPESP, and director of UNICAMP. From 2005 to 2020, he was the scientific director of FAPESP. Brito Cruz is a member of Brazilian Academy of Sciences, fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He received the Ordre de Palme Académique and the Order of the British Empire. And most importantly, for our discussions here today, he was the creator of FAPESP Bioenergy Research Program, BIOEN, and the BBEST conference back in 2009. BBEST was envisioned more than 10 years ago to be a venue where we could showcase the best science and technology presented by the top experts in the world. It's an international conference that covers all topics. It's the place where you can find research results from the BIOEN program in all divisions and all the cooperation alliances we have. Biomass, biofuels, biorefineries, engines and aviation applications, sustainability and impacts. This edition of the conference is about innovation. We have roundtables with the industry, sessions with startups, sessions to discuss partnerships, investing and financing, and many sessions with the cutting-edge science under development across the world. BBEST traditionally organizes a policy day that opens the conference, and this is where we partnered with Biofuture Platform for a joint BBEST-Biofuture Conference and Summit. We have 450 registered participants so far from 34 countries, and our registration is still open for those who are interested. Before we start with the webinar, I want to show you the next structure of the conference, since we had to postpone due to COVID. Okay, the new plans are August 13, we start a kickoff of webinars. Today we decided to discuss the recently launched Biofuture Principles for post-COVID recovery. The focus now is Brazil. All registered BBEST-Biofuture participants are given special access to post questions. This is important. If you can, please post questions to the chat box, and we will try to answer at the end of this webinar. Next webinar, it's global. We want to discuss the biofuture principles in the global arena. Invitation will be coming soon. Its date is not yet final. We are trying to have this September, October 2020. Okay? Then we have a virtual conference. Okay? 30 November to December 2nd, instead of the on-site conference, we're going to have a series of online events with a brief policy forum and reformulated poster sessions, all digital with audio, okay? Pay attention to the deadlines on the site. We are planning an event for posters that bring the conference to more exposure, more opportunities for interaction. We are planning exposition spaces that will allow for more interaction among the participants and the sponsors using a digital platform. And at the end, we will award best poster prizes, and we will also send conference certificates. Okay, 24 to 26 May 2021 is what we expect to be able to have a hybrid conference at the original place, the Renaissance Center, the Renaissance Conference Center in the Renaissance Hotel in São Paulo. Okay, we are moving into giving the opportunity to everyone that wants to present presentially or digitally. We will keep the original program. We will have a policy day, parallel sessions, roundtables, exhibits, technical tours, and all the interesting activities we already had. All BBEST-Biofuture 2020 registered participants are welcome to check our websites on the next steps. You are all already registered for 2021 events. If you have submitted a paper for oral or poster presentations, you will have the opportunity to update or change, okay? You can also transfer paid registration to other colleagues. We will keep you posted on all the forthcoming activities. Thank you very much for coming to our webinar, and I would like now to give the word to Renato Godinho, our first speaker.
Hello, good morning or afternoon, depending on your time zone, and thank you very much, Professor Glaucia. I'm very, very honored to be here among so many distinguished colleagues and dear friends, and to kick off this webinar series of this partnership between Biofuture Platform and BBEST. For the holding of the joint conference. So with the postponement, we are now kickstarting our series of webinars. And the first we chose, as Professor Glaucia said, a topic that is, I would say, very important and very emergent and crucial as an emergency for us to consider, which is the Biofuture Principles for post-COVID recovery. So those principles, they have been launched just yesterday by the Biofuture platform. And just before I get into what those principles are, they have been internationally announced in the media and in the website of the Biofuture platform. And I'm speaking here as the chairperson of the Biofuture platform. And before I get into them, I would like first to briefly go over some of the context we are living in. So please, next slide. Well, as you know, the pandemic that we are living through has created this unprecedented crisis, not only on health, but also on the economy. The response measures to the pandemic they have also affected the economy, and the energy system is no exception. So it has also been impacted through the lockdowns or the confinement measures that have impacted energy demand in many cases. But not all of the energy sources were impacted in a similar manner. So the renewables, for instance, in the power sector, and we are talking about hydropower, solar, and wind power, they have actually experienced growth in the first quarter of 2020. And I'm going through data provided by the International Energy Agency, headquartered in Paris, which serves as the facilitator of the Biofuture platform as a secretariat. And so those sources of energy were driven by an increase in renewable electricity generation, even while coal and oil were hit hardest. And why is that? Because in the power sector, sometimes the renewables, intermittent renewables like solar and wind power, they have priority for dispatch. So this means that their situation was not as heavily impacted as other forms of energy. And looking into the renewables that we are concerned about here, the biomass-derived renewables, including in the heat and industry sector and the transportation biofuels, those are very heavily affected by the decline in demand. And we will see that there is a double impact here. Next slide, please. So as you can see from this chart from the IEA, the biofuel production in 2020 is estimated to fall by 13% throughout the year because of the reduced transport activity. So if you have, for instance, policies that mandate share of biofuels from the total fuel use, if this total fuel use falls, of course, the share of biofuels falls alongside it, and this is one impact. There is a second impact, which is that the low gasoline and diesel prices, we all know about the huge fall in the oil prices around the world, so we are setting a new level here for low prices. They are also influencing the relative competitiveness of those fuels, the renewables and the biofuels. So if you are for instance, a biofuel producer now in these times, you are selling less of your product and for a smaller price. So this is what in general is happening, and this is something that is very much of concern to the sector. Even when we have opportunities now to grow better, there is a short-term concern that is very important. So you can see in the chart, separated by ethanol and biodiesel production, the black dots that you can see for 2020 and 2021 were the original demand projection from the IEA before the pandemic starts, and now the resulting projection considering already the effects of the pandemic. So next slide, please. While this is happening generally throughout the world, not all of the regions are affected in the same way. So you can see here in the pictures for United States and Brazil, they are the largest markets in the world, consumers and producers for biofuels. They were very heavily affected, and you can see the projected fall in demand for 2020 and 2000 in Brazil and in the United States, as opposed to the red dots, which was the forecast before the pandemic. On the other hand, you can see that other regions, depending on the policies that they are implementing, so in China and in India, which are emerging markets for biofuels, they are starting to roll more ambitious policies for the transportation biofuels, both in China and in India. And you can see there that the production has not only not falling, but continued to grow. So this chart is the growth level, not the total sales. So it is continuing to grow, although less than was originally forecast, as you can see from the red dots in the chart. Next slide, please. Now let's take a look at why this is important, not only for biofuel producers, not only for the sector, but for the world and the energy transition that we are going through. So bioenergy in all the sectors, it plays an essential role in the scenarios for low carbon development from all of the major agencies and scientific bodies that are doing the calculations regarding what is needed for the world to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement and avoid a large disaster from climate change. So you have to have bioenergy in all those scenarios, even with all the other solutions in place. So as you can see from this scenario by the IEA, so from 2015, which is the actual level that we have, in order to maintain a course compatible with the goals of the Paris Agreement, in 2030, the total bioenergy use has to double. So you have the chart here, you have to double the amount of bioenergy being used. And the green share of the column that you can see is the use in transport. And in transport, it is even, we need a larger growth. So we need a triple amount of biofuels used in the transportation sector from 2015 to 2030 to keep to the Paris goals. If you move even forward in the future, this movement will need to happen again. So in the 30 following years, the bioenergy share, that large share from 2030 has to increase again the consumption twofold in total and triple again in the transportation sector. This means that we have from now to 2060 to multiply biofuels in the transportation sector by 9 if we wish to fulfill the goals of the Paris Agreement. And even more, if we need to keep with the stretch goal of 1.5 degrees, then we have to deploy bioenergy with carbon capture and storage in a very large amount. So these projections require 71 exajoules of modern bioenergy being used, up from 18 exajoules today. And this with other side products, such as the bioproducts, biomaterials, bioplastics, this supporting a whole bioeconomy that is advanced and using more and more local materials to complement the use of fossil sources. So this is why it is important that we should be concerned with the effects of the crisis. So we have to grow. We cannot afford to stand this sector to go down. So next slide, please. So here we get into the role of the Biofuture platform. For those of you who still don't know about the Biofuture platform, it is a coalition of 20 countries that looked at those scenarios that I have described and saw that the situation is not good, and built this coalition to work together, exchange experiences, lessons, so that they can work and try and increase the deployment of the bioeconomy at large in a faster degree. So those are the countries. You can see that they are very representative, some of the largest economies in the world, the largest markets for the bioeconomy, the largest consumers, and some of the most important technology providers as well are united in this coalition. And the International Energy Agency, as I say, the agency headquartered in Paris, serves as the secretariat or facilitator since 2018. So next slide, please. The Biofuture platform has already accomplished since 2016 a lot of products and deliverables, reports, vision statement. I invite all of you to look at it in the Biofuture platform website. And now we, looking at the pandemic situation, decided to build the principles. And the process, I'll briefly describe how the process went of reaching and achieving the principles that I'm going to present. So it all started with the decision by the core group countries, which is the managing body of the Biofuture platform. It is composed by Brazil, Canada, India, the Netherlands, UK, and the United States, and they decided to work on this proposal for a set of voluntary principles that would put the bioeconomy in relief, in the relief and recovery programs that countries are working on. So the broad recovery programs from COVID, would also need to contemplate the bioeconomy sector in their concept. So by June, there was a presentation and a debate of a first version of those principles in the all-member group meeting with all the 20 Biofuture member countries, also with a dialogue with the participation of bioeconomy industry leaders, CEOs from around the world. The draft was well received, and people thought it was quite important to move forward. And the consultation process was approved by all the member countries. Following that, the following 2 months were successive rounds of open electronic consultation, and with participation of the governments, open to participate by industry, experts, international organizations, other stakeholders had a chance to look at the principles and see. In our case, in the government of Brazil, also the Ministry of Mines and Energy has analyzed the principles and proposed its endorsement. And finally, we have the final approval of the principles by the 20 Biofuture member countries by the end of July. And we are then getting ready for the official announcement, which happened just yesterday. So we are here very hot out of the oven. We are looking at those principles here. Let's see what they are, and then invite our guests to discuss what their meaning is for Brazil specifically. Next slide. So here are the principles themselves. They are on purpose, not too detailed. So we have to recognize that every country has their reality. So they are voluntary principles with guidelines, and then each country shall consider how we can translate those principles into policy according to each country's reality. And the first is, and I think very important, do not backtrack. So in some cases, there is a temptation in face of economic crisis, people are having difficulties producing and the demand to move back on some environmental programs, to say, let's pause this, we're having difficulties. And the idea of this principle is resist this temptation, ensure the continuity and the long-term predictability of bioenergy, biofuels, bio-based material targets, and the existing policy mechanisms that were successful in your country. So that is the minimum. So do not move back. So because it will pay off very badly in the long run. So keep what you have and what is working. Principle 2, consider the short-term support for producers. And this is a temporary measure that countries should consider because of the double impact that I have described, the impact on demand and the impact of prices. That could, in some cases, work to destabilize the bioenergy industry in some countries, depending on their capital, their capacity of solvency. So you have to consider these kinds of things in the context of the relief packages that the whole economy sectors are receiving, depending on the case, in the COVID recovery programs around the world. So 3, reassess the fossil fuel subsidies. And this is important because there is still a continuing policy of applying subsidies in many countries to fossil fuels. And this worsens the situation of competitivity with the renewable clean alternative, which are the biofuels, which already have to compete against the negative externalities of fossil fuels. But we have to recognize that those subsidies are politically tricky to pull back once a country starts to depend on them. So the population can see the increase in prices very badly. So the idea is to take advantage now of this low price environment of oil to reassess whether you have space to remove those subsidies and ensure a fairer playing field. I would say also that in the same way, if a country does not have fossil fuel subsidies, as the case in Brazil, then you should also consider additional measures to keep increasing the playing field to make it fairer for the renewable fuels as well. So principle 4 is very important and very broad. This is about integrating the bioeconomy sector as a part of the broader program. So there are packages, for instance, to the most affected industries by the COVID. One very good example is coming from France in the aviation sector. The government is building a support package for the aviation sector, which is very hard hit by the crisis. But in order to access this support package, the airline companies in France will have to commit to a number of environmental sustainability targets. One of them that is specifically considered in France is committing to a certain level and percentage of aviation biofuels. And this would be a big increase in support for the aviation biofuel industry and make it start this industry at commercial scale. So we are hearing for several regions of the world, build back better, taking advantage of the COVID to then rebuild with more concern for sustainability. These principles are adding a fourth B, so build back better with bio. So that is the idea for principle 4. And principle 5, last but not least, is reward sustainability, which is a major principle to guide the programs. You need the biofuels, bioenergy, biomaterials, the policies, the practices, all the agricultural practices to be sustainable. And the idea is not only control sustainability, but also reward it in accordance to sustainability. And we have a major example of this being put in practice in Brazil, which is the RenovaBio program. And I hope we can hear from our speakers here more of this outstanding program that is, for instance, promoting those positive externalities that the biomass provides to the climate and internalize them via a market mechanism, and thus provides incentives to more. So those are the 5 principles that I briefly discussed here, and I'd like to close my presentation for some questions for our distinguished guests. We have the luck here to have Plinio and Professor Brito, which have decades of experience with biofuels and are crucial for the history of biofuels in Brazil. So those are the questions that I'd like also to kickstart beyond those of the audience for this debate here. So what these principles would mean for the debate going on biofuels policies in Brazil. So how we can apply them better, how can we apply and align Brazil with the 5 principles? We are certainly strong in some areas, others may be lacking. Which are those? The third question about the RenovaBio, as I mentioned, that is a major example of principle 5. But how do you see the implementation of RenovaBio going, specifically in relation to that and the other principles, how it is behaving in this COVID crisis, how are policymakers looking at it? And finally, what in your views could be specific policies, measures, and actions that would be the most important or urgent to implement, given the specific situation in Brazil, how it stands right now as one leader with a very developed market, but at the same time heavily affected by this pandemic. So with that, I conclude, Professor Glaucia, and over to you.
Thank you, Renato. It's wonderful to see our country moving forward towards a sustainable energy matrix. It's great to see so many levels of our government involved in this effort, and so many different initiatives at the non-governmental and research capacities of each state taking place in this challenge. So I'd like to invite Plinio Nastari to make his presentation and perhaps answer some of the challenges that Renato posted. Thank you, Plinio, for being here.
Thank you very much, Professor Glaucia, Souza. I also send my compliments to Councillor Renato Godinho and his leadership before the Biofuture platform, and all the country members and the IEA as facilitator. I would also like to greet Professor Brito Cruz, who is participating in this panel, and the organizers of this webinar, Professor Horta Nogueira, Dr. Heitor Cantarella, and all the other members. Well, I have been assigned with the task of making a few comments on how we see Brazil faring with regards to the 5 principles which have been approved by the Biofuture platform and announced yesterday. And I have prepared a few slides which I would like to share. So please, next slide, please. These are, again, the 5 principles. Consider short-term COVID support for producers, reassess fossil fuel subsidies, build back better with bio, reward sustainability, and do not backtrack. Well, let's make a few comments on each one of them. Next, please. In regards to short-term COVID support for producers, what have we seen the action done here in Brazil? Well, as mentioned by Councillor Godinho, the biggest impact which was observed initially was a double shock, a shock of lowered demand and lowered prices for oil and gasoline, which impacted ethanol and biodiesel, of course. The impact on prices has been compensated in recent months. So the problem has been still the residual problem, a reduction in consumption. To overcome and to bring relief to producers on that matter, we have seen the Brazilian government approve emergency line of credit of 3 billion reais, which is approximately $650 million to help ethanol producers store ethanol during the crop, because all this happened at the outset of the largest crop in Brazil, sugarcane harvesting crop in the Center-South region, which started April 1st. And this line of credit was a good decision, and it came in time. It was approved the first week of June. And you can see in these 2 graphs what has happened with consumption of both hydrous ethanol and gasohol, or E27, in Brazil. For hydrous ethanol, on an accumulated basis, January to June, consumption of hydrous ethanol has fallen by 15.6%, and gasohol has fallen by 11.7%. Another measure which has been maintained and was really important was the maintenance of the chronogram for increase of biodiesel blending. There is a chronogram approved, and on March 1st, this chronogram was maintained, and we went in Brazil from 11 to 12% all over the country, and it is approved already a yearly 1% increase until 2023, going to be 15 starting March 2023. So this has not changed. Next, please. Reassess fossil fuel subsidies. Well, with that regard, the IEA has calculated that so far this year, more than 40 countries have spent over $181 billion in global subsidies towards petroleum-derived fossil fuels. Last year, this number was 317 billion in subsidies. And I'm glad to say that in Brazil, the Advisory Council, the National Council on Energy Policy, which advises the president on energy matters, decided to establish a special task force in 2017 to study what could be done to recover investments in refining of oil, which have been stagnant for 40 years, the refining capacity. And through this working group, the concept of building up a vaccine to prevent the reoccurrence of the same price subsidies on gasoline and diesel, which were implemented during 2011-2014 period, which caused a huge harm to ethanol's competitiveness, huge losses to ethanol producers and to Petrobras. A way to create this vaccine would be to propose the privatization of oil refineries in Brazil. Why? Essentially because at this moment it's very easy, very tempting for the state to interfere politically in these prices, because Petrobras holds 98.2% of refining capacity in Brazil. And the suggestion was, well, let's reduce this monopoly on refining, and then it will be impossible for the state to interfere again in these prices. This has been approved, and Petrobras is currently in the process of privatizing 8 of its 13 oil refineries, and this is a process which should be completed by July next year. The first oil refinery, the largest in Bahia, has already received a binding proposal, and confirmation of that disinvestment should be announced in the coming weeks. So this is a good measure, and I think in that way Brazil is trying to get rid of the possibility of a reoccurrence of subsidies in the prices of fuels in Brazil. Next. Build back better with bio. Well, one of the biggest programs at this moment is the implementation of the Sanitary National Plan. Still, about 50% of households in Brazil do not hold proper sanitary measures. And the idea is that by the end of this decade, this proportion raises to over 90%. We hope that this happens in a way in which the energetic use of municipal solid waste is used for biodigestion, for production of biogas, biomethane. Let's remember that the potential for generation of biogas in Brazil from all sources is estimated at 85 million cubic meters per day, which is the equivalent of 3 times the capacity of the gas pipeline linking Brazil and Bolivia, which has a capacity of 30 million cubic meters per day, but only 20 million are being used today, and is equivalent to 44% of the diesel in use in Brazil. So it's a huge potential, not only from the use of agricultural residues, but also municipal solid waste and other uses from agri-industrial residues. Next, please. Reward sustainability. Well, I think, as Councilor Godinho mentioned, the biggest example of a program in that regard is RenovaBio, Brazil's national biofuels plan, which was approved as a law in December 2017 by a majority of the members of Congress, a massive majority, in a very swift and quick approval process. And this whole system has been regulated in 2018, 2019. It's a system, as many of you know, based on voluntary certification for energy environmental efficiency. 229 biofuel producers, ethanol and biodiesel, and 1 biomethane, have voluntarily showed up to be certified, and this has happened through inspection firms which are world renowned, under a very stiff program with eligibility criteria that includes criteria for not allowing feedstocks to come from land which has been previously cleared from forest, and in full obedience to Brazil's forestry code, which is the most stringent in the world. Well, at this moment, all the hurdles, all the difficulties in a very complex regulatory system have been overcome. Sales of decarbonization credits started in April, and at this moment we have a massive number of credits already being offered, two issues were still at stake. One is the taxation over the decarbonization credits. This was under discussion until last night, and I'm glad to announce that this has been solved. Why it was under discussion still until last night was essentially because the Congress had approved a taxation level of 15% in line with the general taxation for financial assets. However, the Ministry of Economy thought otherwise and decided to tax this new asset, this new environmental asset, by 34%. And the president followed up that recommendation and vetoed that decision by the Congress. And last night, essentially, the Brazilian Congress, the lower house and the Senate, ruled out the veto. And so now we are back to the 15%. I wish we had 0% because it's a new asset and it brings the wrong message to be taxing it. But it's still, we are at a normal level of 15%. The second thing is that we are in the process of a revision of the national target because of the lowered consumption of fuels brought by COVID. And this is still under discussion. Next, please. And this slide essentially shows in blue the curve of decarbonization, which was approved last year, and the forecast until 2029, and in red the new curve, which has been proposed by the federal government due to COVID. Essentially, the government is considering at this moment a shift down of this curve. In the blue curve, Brazil would be saving 700 million tons of CO2 equivalent in 10 years, which is about the equivalent of the emission, the whole emission of France or Germany in 1 year. Ethanol has saved since 2003 535 million tons. So it's a very significant target. And essentially, because of COVID, from that excuse, there is this proposal now on the table, which is still under technical consideration and should be examined by the National Council on Energy Policy after the final technical considerations of the RenovaBio committee, which is still under study and have not been finalized. But this is the, in red curve, is the proposal which has come to public consultation. And you can see that for 2020, this would mean a reduction of 50% from 29.06 million CBIOs or tons of CO2 to 14.53 million CBIOs. That was what was submitted to public consultation. Next. And how RenovaBio is faring? Well, the target for 2020, which was submitted to public consultation, therefore, was 14.53 million tons of CO2 or CBIOs. And until August 11, 2 days ago, there were 5.3 million CBIOs or tons of CO2 offered at B3 exchange already. In the previous 30 days, 3.64 million CBIOs added to that basket. of which 72,000 already acquired by distribution companies, and 39,000 CBIOs acquired by non-obligated parties. And this is what is under consultation. So do not backtrack. We hope that we don't have a significant reduction neither for this year nor for the next 10 years, because that is what exactly brings predictability for investments in biofuels, bioenergy, in energy for transport in Brazil. These are my comments. This is what I would like to present as being our observation of what is happening and taking into consideration the 5 principles which were announced yesterday by the Biofuture platform. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Plinio. It's wonderful to see how much Brazilian policy has progressed over the last few years and that we have started on the right foot. We are still struggling a bit on the little details, but it's very much a policy that could be replicated across the world when you have so much to offer as Brazil has on the biomass front. I would like now to invite Professor Brito to make his presentation. We have a lot to learn on science that is being coming in Brazil for many years now. Brazil is leader of scientific progress on this front, on bioenergy, and Professor Brito has had a wonderful contribution in this field. Thank you, Brito, for being here.
Thank you, Glaucia, for the presentation and for inviting me to participate. I'm so happy to be here with this distinguished panel. And if we could have the slides. Okay, so I'm going to use a few minutes to give you an idea of bioenergy in Brazil, or how Brazil found a way to reduce emissions in a sustainable way, while at the same time attaining energy self-sufficiency. Those are 3 things which not always come together, but somehow Brazil managed to have those 3 things together, those 3 benefits together, since the alcohol initiative, as it was called, alcohol program, was created in 1975. Next slide, please. So I'm going to highlight to you the 4 points which are in this slide. First, give you some information about the use of energy in Brazil, which is heavily affected by the alcohol program started in 1975. And in which usage in 2019 or 18, 40% of the primary energy supply in Brazil was from renewable sources, which is a especially high number. Very few countries in the world have this kind of percentage, as I will highlight. Then I will very briefly go over how research in Brazil was essential for these achievements, especially sustainability research. Because, you know, researching sustainability is something that is mostly done in public sector organizations, because the companies tend to worry about productivity, chemical processes, efficiency, and the government, the state has to look at the environment, the sustainability of the initiatives, and so on. So that sustainability research, especially in public organizations, has been very, very important for the development of sustainable biofuels in Brazil. And then third point is how bioenergy is necessary for the world to reduce emissions. Many people tend to think that this discussion about energy is a competition of bioenergy against wind, against solar, against geothermal, but it's not. It's a game of cooperation. The world will attain a reduction in emissions or a controlled amount of emissions only if several different alternatives of renewable energy are used. There's no one that is going to be the silver bullet for reducing emissions. So I'm going to go over that. And I will end with some principles for bioenergy, which I find especially interesting, especially if they could be applied to all types of energy. Next slide, please. So my first point is, as I have already mentioned, you will see in the figure on the left, the green bar shows that more than 40% of all the primary energy supply in Brazil in 2019 came from renewable energy. And this green bar, those 40%, are composed in such a way that energy from sugarcane, that is bioenergy, the way Brazil works with bioenergy, is the most important chunk of energy, responsible for 16% of all the energy used in Brazil. Next slide, please. And this other slide shows the case for one of the Brazilian states, which is the state of São Paulo, now showing in the form of an evolution curve, where the graph on the right starts in 1980 and goes up to 2018. And you will see that in the state of São Paulo in 1980, 62% of all the energy used came from oil. In 2018, only 32%, almost half. So the importance of oil was cut by almost 50% in those 38 years. And this happened in good part because the participation of sugarcane grew from 14% of the total to 35%, more than doubled, again from 1980 to 2018. It's important to bear in mind that the state of São Paulo is the most industrialized state in Brazil. It has a population, as you will see on the left, of 42 million people, so it's more or less the size of Argentina or Spain, and it responds for 1/3 of Brazil's GDP. So it's a heavily industrialized and has a very dynamic economy. The economy of the state of São Paulo is larger than the economy of Argentina and slightly smaller than the economy of Spain. So it's difficult to reduce oil to the extent that is shown in this figure, from 62% to 32%, while the state is growing, developing. Most of the development indicators are much better in the state of São Paulo today than they were in 1980. So that's another example of the effect of bioenergy in a region of Brazil. Next slide, please. So this was achieved by learning about bioenergy. And Brazil has started to learn about bioenergy a long time ago. And one of the classic scientific articles about bioenergy is this one that I highlight on the top, by Professor José Goldenberg from the University of São Paulo and colleagues, in which in 1978, they came up with this idea of calculating the energy balance for ethanol production crops. That is, calculating how much energy do you put in, how much energy do you put out, do you get out, and assessing if this would be an energetically economic way, and also connecting that to the emissions of carbon dioxide that would come from this type of crop or from this type of production of energy, which is a topic which in 1978 nobody talked about. It was something very, very new and original by then. Brazil has learned a lot about that, and that's another article there which I reproduced the title, researchers from the University of Campinas calculating how greenhouse gases emissions occurred in the production of ethanol from sugarcane in Brazil. Next slide, please. Researchers in Brazil also worked a lot to increase the productivity of sugarcane. This is an example, a review article in which Professor Glaucia Souza and colleagues study how sugarcane for bioenergy production has had its productivity increased by learning about the genes and the improvements that could be done in the agriculture of the plant, which can bring the productivity from 84 tons per hectare to perhaps 381 tons per hectare. The 212 is already done in many farms in Brazil. So having more productivity for sugarcane means saving land in the production of ethanol. Next slide, please. This other slides goes to the point of sustainability, which I highlighted in the beginning, is this book about bioenergy and sustainability, Bridging the Gaps, led by a team of Brazilian researchers, Glaucia Souza, Reinaldo Victoria, Carlos Joly, Luciano Verdade, supported by the São Paulo Research Foundation. The book is freely available at the link which is on the screen. And what they did is they organized a team of 137 researchers from 82 institutions in 24 countries. And the question they set out to respond was, is there a sustainable way to produce biofuels? How can we work with the world to make biofuels more and more sustainable by following certain practices and certain principles? And everything is in this publication, fundamental publication about sustainability in bioenergy. Next slide, please. Researchers in Brazil also study how it would be possible to expand the production of biofuels in the world to other regions, especially to Africa, in which sugarcane could be, as they say in the title of the article on the right top, sugarcane, a way out of energy poverty, essential for the development of many poor regions which are in the tropical zone of the world. Next slide, please. Researchers in Brazil produce a lot of knowledge about sugarcane, which is shown in this figure. The green line shows that they publish more articles than researchers in the US, in India, Australia, China, and Cuba. And this little book, which is also freely available at this link, tells the story of how researchers in universities, research institutes, and companies worked together to make ethanol in Brazil sustainable, a saver of emissions, and contributor to the self-sufficiency of energy in Brazil. Next slide, please. The São Paulo Research Foundation, FAPESP, is doing a strong work towards this by supporting research, more than 5,000 research grants and fellowships in topics related to bioenergy, biofuels, sugarcane, agriculture, sustainability, all topics related to the sustainable production of bioenergy. Next slide, please. And this effort, organized by FAPESP, as I mentioned before, includes academy, universities, research institutes, and companies like those which are listed here, big Brazilian or foreign companies, Oxiteno, Braskem, ETH, Boeing, Microsoft, Male. +5 is +5 big automakers in Brazil, Peugeot, Citroën, Usina São Martinho, in which researchers from all those companies worked together with researchers in universities in the state of São Paulo to address topics of interest for the company in the bioenergy landscape. Next slide. Also, small companies were funded by the São Paulo Research Foundation to develop technologies related to bioenergy, 133 grants in the last 10 years. for those small companies, many of them startup companies, to develop new technologies like biological control in sugarcane plantations, like more efficient enzymes or processes for producing ethanol, which get 3 or 4% more efficient, saving lots of money and saving lots of land and lots of energy. Next slide, please. In terms of what happens in the world in renewable energy, this figure shows a plot which has several countries classified according to the horizontal axis is what percentage of the total primary energy supply in the country comes from renewables. You will see here in the bottom, middle bottom, that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 countries which have more than 40% of their energy coming from renewable sources. You will see there in the top countries like Korea, Israel, Netherlands, Japan, for which 3% or 5% of the energy comes from renewable sources. The United States, 8% maybe is on the top of the figure. The UK, almost 9%. But those 5 countries in the bottom have more than 40%. Brazil is one of them. And you will notice that the other 4 are small countries with small populations. The largest one there is Sweden, which has a population of 10 million people, which is 20 times smaller than the size of the population of Brazil. So the point here is to highlight that having 40% of the primary energy supply coming from renewable sources is a great achievement that Brazil has done, and that many times Brazilians do not recognize well. They think that this is a normal thing, and it's not. Many of us think it's normal because when we were of age 20 or 15 or 16, we would go with our families to the gas station and our dad would say, okay, fill it up with ethanol. And we think that anywhere in the world, people would go to a gas station and fill it up with ethanol. It's not like that. The program that Brazil has done is very singular and very special and very beneficial for Brazil. Next slide, and for the world. Next slide, please. And on top of that, another next one. The program of bioenergy in Brazil creates and maintains 594,000 jobs. Renewable energy in Brazil maintains 893,000 jobs, which is a lot of jobs, especially in the world of today. So it's an initiative that created sustainability for the country, self-sufficiency of the energy, and jobs for the Brazilians. Next slide, please. The point here is that, as I highlighted in the beginning, bioenergy is going to be part of the solution for reducing emissions. It's not the only one. There's no silver bullet, not wind, nor solar, not geothermal, not nuclear. Maybe fusion, if one day fusion really works. But the way things are looking today, you need to add from several sources. Next slide, please. And this here shows from a publication by Lou Fulton, who used to be the executive director for the International Energy Agency, in which they analyze the evolution of the energy mix for transport energy by fuel. You will see here the last bar, 2075, about 40% of the energy will come from biofuels. If you want to reduce emissions to keep in the 2-degree scenario, 2DS, there is a scenario in which you limit the increase in temperature of the planet by 2 degrees, to 2 degrees. Next slide, please. And this shows how you would have to, again, International Energy Agency, to add several initiatives like bioenergy, wind, solar, biofuels, other renewables, which is the blue part of the wedge here, in several wedges to drive down the emissions of carbon dioxide to save 4.2 gigatons of energy each year in terms of emissions of carbon dioxide. So the point here is you need to add those. You don't want to compete those. You don't want one of them to win over the other. It's not a competition. It's a game of collaboration, of addition, of sum. Next slide, please. At this point, many people, especially here in Brazil, it's very common. People, no, but electric cars are going to do everything. And sometimes it seems to me that people forget that electricity has to be generated somewhere because the car doesn't generate the electricity. And then you have to enter into a discussion of how is this electricity going to be generated? Is it going to be generated in a sustainable way? Is it going to be a thermal coal-fired power source, which is very dirty and very emitting, or is it going to be an hydroelectric dam, which emits much less, and where is it going to be? So there is also this point about the batteries, which I want to make now. Next slide, please. Just to remind that there are challenges, relevant challenges. This is, I took from an article that came up in Nature, the scientific journal Nature, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, about the trends in battery technology. And it's a complicated figure, but what I want you to look at is the following. The vertical axis is energy density, how many watts-hour per kilogram of the battery. And you will see that the largest number there is 400. And the horizontal axis is time. And then they come up with this green line here and say, maybe in 2017, we are going to be at 320 watts-hour per kilogram. Now, if you go to the detail on the right, you will see that the largest number in terms of density there under predicted maximums is 1,000 with a battery of lithium oxygen, which they classify as may prove impossible to achieve. So if you want to think about batteries and you want to think about their energy density, you have to have in mind the number 1,000. It's about the best that would ever be achieved. Next slide, please. What is 1,000? 1,000 watts-hour per kilogram on the horizontal axis would be the end of the axis here. And then you can look also at the energy density, watts-hour per liter, the size of the battery. The horizontal axis relates to the weight of the battery. The other one relates to the size, the volume of the battery. Again, a number around 1,000 there. And each one of the colors is technology for batteries. But anyway, they are always below 1,000. And the third slide, next one, will show you what happens. One more, please. When you compare the energy density in the vertical axis, the energy specific energy, watts-hour per kilogram on the horizontal axis, when you compare the batteries, and I have the little figure that I have shown in the preceding slide, on the left where they are, below 1,000, and you compare that with ethanol and with gasoline in terms of energy density or specific energy. So you see, batteries have a long way to go in terms of providing the energy that we can find today in liquid fuels, with the caveat that only the red dot in the center relates to a liquid fuel which can be sustainable in terms of emission and in terms of its production. Next slide, please. I will finish by highlighting to you some of the points that have been made about biofuels in the world, because as you know, the debate about biofuels in the world has been at some points very, very strong, with criticism and challenges and so on. And I think that this set of 6 principles, 5 actually, that the Newfield Council on Bioethics created about biofuels it seems to me especially useful. They say biofuels development should not be at the expense of people's essential rights. I think very few people are going to disagree with this, including access to sufficient food and water, health rights, work rights, and land entitlement. The second principle states that biofuels should be environmentally sustainable. Perfect. Third one, biofuels should contribute to a net reduction of total greenhouse gas emissions and not exacerbate global climate change. Perfect. That became one of the objectives of using biofuels maybe 20, 25 years ago. I say became because when Brazil created the alcohol program in 1975, Brazil was not really worried about emissions. Brazil was worried about moving the cars in the street in 1976. But then we learned, or Brazil learned, that we could move the cars and reduce emissions. The fourth principle, biofuels should develop in accordance with trade principles. Actually, everything we do should be in accordance with trade principles that are fair and recognize the rights of people to just rewards, including labor rights, intellectual property rights. Five, costs and benefits of biofuels should be distributed in an equitable way. Very perfect again. Six, if the first five principles are respected and if biofuels can play a crucial role in mitigating dangerous climate change, then, depending on additional key considerations, there is a duty to develop such biofuels. So this is a very strong set of ethical issues, which I want just to comment with you. My last comment will be on the next slide. Why should we consider that only biofuels should follow all those beautiful principles? I think that all energy should follow those principles because all forms of providing energy should not be at the expense of people's essential rights. All forms of generating energy should be environmentally sustainable. All forms of generating energy should contribute to a net reduction of total greenhouse gas emissions. I don't know how oil is going to do with principle number 3. All forms of energy should develop in accordance with trade principles that are fair and recognize the rights of people to just reward. And costs and benefits of energy should be distributed in an equitable way. So that's the thing that I wanted to highlight to you about biofuels. Why is that the world is so critical of biofuels and so lenient with other forms of energy which tend to be much more aggressive to people, to the environment, to the planet, as we discuss how we are going to reduce emissions in the world. Next slide is the concluding one. I wanted to highlight to you that Brazil has 40% of its energy coming from renewable sources. Bioenergy contributes 16 points of those 40%. It's the largest chunk. It's very important for renewable energy in Brazil. Research in Brazil was and is relevant for those achievements, especially when we talk about sustainability research, which allowed Brazil to create public policy and associate that to technology development. National programs led by the São Paulo Research Foundation, the National Bank for Development, were very important in that. Bioenergy is necessary for the world any way you look at the problem of emissions. You will find you need to consider bioenergy. And together with other renewables, bioenergy will be one of the wedges that will help the world to reduce emissions, and we should fight for the principles for bioenergy and make them into principles for energy. The world is going to be a better place if we pay attention to those principles. Thank you very much.
Obrigado, Professor Brito. Thank you, Professor Brito. We now move into the Q&A. We have many questions here. I will start with a question for Renato. What are the barriers for us to implement fully the biofuture principles?
Okay, so I think every country has to examine its situation. No? So we are here in this webinar looking at the situation in Brazil, and I think Dr. Plinio has done an excellent overview, principle by principle, what are the policies that are already being implemented, and some caution against some steps that could run against one of the principles or the other. And then there is also the question of barriers to growing bioenergy in general. And I'm very happy to answer also on that one, because the Biofuture platform in 2018 has launched a report called Creating the Biofuture Report. And I invite all of you to download it in full in the Biofuture platform website. And a key section in that report is about the barriers to further growth. And what was detected there, based on research with the policymakers and other stakeholders, are four main barriers. So lack of finance, competitivity of the industry as a nascent industry in some cases, third, unfavorable policy frameworks, and fourth, a limited sustainable feedstock supply. I would say that in the case of Brazil, maybe the others could say that better than we do. We do not have much of the concern regarding feedstock supply. So Brazil has very ample reserves of feedstock, has enormous potential of growth without expanding its agricultural frontier. There is enormous room and enormous potential for biomass. So we are very lucky. And the other three, I think, can be all traced back to policy. So if you have the proper policy frameworks, and the report advocated for a complete policy package, you have to have demand promotion policies, like biofuels mandates are one example. There could be others for biomaterials. You could have also what is called a technology push. So policies that the government can provide incentives to research, to innovation, getting the new and efficient technologies from the so-called valley of death, so they can overcome these problems of birth and reach the economies of scale to be competitive. But they need this investment in research and development and these kinds of things that the policies can provide. And the lack of finance is also one part institutional deficiencies of the banks and the international finance institutions, which are not currently designing products adapted to bioenergy. And in other cases, in the other half is also related to the policy, because if you have a favorable policy framework and then you have a good business case for growing your production capacity, finance will eventually arrive. So all of those is traced back to a good policy framework, and Brazil may be one of the most successful cases. As Professor Brito described a bit of the history, you have decades of history of successes, but we also have a lot to do, and there is a large curve of growth that we need to pursue, and the world even more. So we need to lead the way forward in Brazil, I would say, and many others are looking at our experience and see how we will go.
Okay, thank you very much. I will ask now, the next question is for Plinio. What's the current stage of Brazil's bioenergy industry in comparison to benchmark countries?
Well, thank you very much, Glaucia. I think Brazil stands very well. Last crop just ended March 31st. Brazil produced 35.6 billion liters of ethanol, most of it for fuel purposes. Biodiesel, 5.9.
We are having a connection problem. So I am asking the next question to Professor Brito. Professor Brito, how do you think research can contribute to all these challenges that we are facing ahead? You mentioned several. Can we pinpoint to some of the answers that we are seeing coming out of the academia and industry cooperations?
Yes, Glaucia. I think that the thing is that even though the Brazilian bioenergy industry has achieved very decent levels of sustainability, there's still a lot to be gained. And there's a lot to be gained, for example, in the agriculture of sugarcane, and that could benefit from research, for example, about biological control in sugarcane plantations. And there is a lot to be gained in improving the engines of the automobiles that are going to use ethanol or ethanol mixed with gasoline. There is a lot to be done in terms of the second generation, as they call, of bioenergy or of biofuels, in which the processing of the celluloses has to become more efficient and more effective. Most of the relevant plants, I'm not sure most, but many of the relevant plants for second generation ethanol production in the world are in Brazil, and they are developing this technology. And it seems to me that it is a great opportunity for Brazil, because having a second generation plant together with a first generation plant seems to be more economically feasible than having the second generation plant alone, because you gain some flexibility. So the short answer to that is there is a lot of room for new research that will contribute to the development of bioenergy in Brazil and in the world.
Yes, I would like to finish by asking last words from Plinio and Renato. We have seen today many examples of success in Brazil, in science, in technology, in industry, in infrastructure, and organization of these initiatives towards a bioeconomy. This is something that many countries would like to have. We have. It's amazing that we have such an example of real life initiatives taking place in Brazil. It's not a prediction, it's a working bioeconomy. So I'm very pleased to be hosting this webinar. I'd like to thank Professor Brito and would like to ask final words from Plinio and Renato.
Thank you very much. The final remarks I would like to make are first that I think in Brazil we have gone long ways in increasing the efficiency in biofuels and bioenergy production, from productivity and diversification. This process will and shall continue. And the big challenge is to establish the policy frameworks which should be in place to induce the private sector and private investment in the desired direction through competition. And trying as much as possible going away from government interference, We know that mandates from the beginning are important to establish the initial ground upon which biofuels should develop. But after a certain point, the development of biofuels and bioenergy should go beyond the need of mandates even. And it is the sort of policy framework Brazil has developed with RenovaBio, which are based on market-driven mechanisms to price carbon emissions and to value the benefit of carbon emission mitigation that should be pursued, going away from exogenous price determination of carbon into endogenous determination, which rewards and takes into account in the long term the benefit of increased efficiency. So I think this is what really matters, and this is the message I would like to leave. The world can expand biofuel and bioenergy production and use in an incredible way, and it's very nice and rewarding to see reputable institutions like the IEA, IRENA, and others reinforcing and supporting that. But in other countries, and in Brazil, what is lacking is the necessary regulatory framework.
Okay. I would like to ask Renato if he has any concluding statements. Renato, your microphone is out.
Oh yeah. So I'm maybe I don't know about the host and technical aspects here, but I would be happy to go on and take a few more questions if possible. I don't know how much more overtime we have, but I know that we have a lot of participants online already. But I was very glad the ground that we covered. Presenting the Biofuture Principles for Post-COVID Recovery. I'm hoping the Biofuture platform will do more of these events focused on the international aspects, but I was very glad today to have this walkthrough and see the significance for Brazil. We have concrete aspects in relation to the principles here in Brazil. So I think what Plinio just mentioned about having the right policy frame is key. So the Biofuture platform is the main item on the agenda is this one. So the bioeconomy is and will continue to be a policy-driven sector. So as long as there is these differences in externalities and differences in the playing field, this will continue to be a policy-driven sector, and so policy is key. So there are wrong ways and good ways to do that, and we have to learn with each other, the countries, and I think we are really optimistic for what the future will bring in this exchange of experiences.
So we are closing in on our time, but we would like to stay here answering more questions. So if those of you did not plan to stay longer, we thank you for your participation. We'll stay here for a few more minutes and we'll follow up on these questions on the next webinars and conference planned for the Biofuture and BBEST joint event. So If you allow me to follow up on some of these questions, I'd like to pose a question to Professor Brito. What is the sector doing to adapt to the effects of climate change? And what is the research progress on climate change on bioenergy?
Well, I've seen research done by sugarcane producers in relation to how cane would behave in a world with more CO2 or less CO2. That would be an example. But I think that most of the efforts in research today are driving towards sustainability in the world as it is today, and to increasing the productivity through the addition of second generation technologies to the first generation technologies, which, though they were and they are very successful in Brazil, first generation technologies are not successful in many other countries in the world. That's a challenge for Brazil, because the world is not going to be happy with an alternative in which there is only one producer of ethanol, which is Brazil, or two with the United States, which is the largest producer, but produces in a way which is not the best in terms of, because it's from corn, in terms of emissions and efficiency, but it's a good way. But the thing is that it seems to me that Brazil should have a plan to facilitate the enlargement of the bioenergy producing bases in the world. That would be good for the bioenergy business in Brazil. And one place, one region where I think bioenergy could expand to in a good way would be some regions of Africa. That's why I think Brazil and producers and researchers should be looking into assisting Africa in using the idea that worked so nicely in Brazil to produce energy in a sustainable way.
Thank you, Brito. I'd like to ask a question to Plinio on principle 4 of the bring better with bio. Can renewable energy, can bio stimulate biomethane, since it seems that the focus is on ethanol and biodiesel?
Certainly. Thank you for the question. By rewarding energy efficiency, as mentioned in the previous comment, not only enlarging productivity, but also diversification, you can increase the score, the energy environmental score of a certain biofuel producer, be it ethanol, biodiesel, biogas, biomethane, or biokerosene. And there is a huge potential still in diversification, not only in second-gen ethanol, as mentioned by Professor Brito, but we see a huge potential in biodigestion of residues, in particular vinasse from distillation, cake filter, bagasse, trash from sugarcane, which by far, because of the volume of residues, represent the largest potential for biogas production in Brazil and in many parts of the world, for that matter. The biogas potential estimated for Brazil at the moment is 85 million cubic meters of gas per day. What does that mean in relative terms? Well, we have the reference of the gas pipeline linking Brazil and Bolivia, which has a capacity of 30 million cubic meters, and of which only less than that are being used today. So it's about 4 times the current use of the gas pipeline linking Brazil and Bolivia as potential, which converted into biomethane would be equivalent to 44% of Brazil's current diesel consumption. So it's a huge potential. So not only from cane residues, but also other agro-industrial organic residues and municipal solid waste. We have a huge potential still to be developed in cogen, which is, as the IEA correctly addresses, the neglected source of energy in many parts of the world, also in Brazil. Cogen, not only from sugarcane bagasse, trash, but also wood chips, can grow a lot. Brazil can do still a lot in that direction. We are still spending a lot of diesel oil being burnt in the northern region, which doesn't make sense to produce electricity in a not sustainable way. And there's a huge potential for sustainable agriculture to be developed in deforested areas to produce biogas, to generate power from that biogas, to purify this biogas into biomethane and use it in energy in transport. So I would say that in bioenergy, even though Brazil has gone a long ways, still we have a book with many blank pages still waiting to be filled without the need of cutting one single tree protected biome. Provided we have the obedience, the establishment and the obedience to appropriate legislation, which is what we have been able to achieve with Renova Bio.
Okay, thank you very much, Plinio. This is great to hear. So many opportunities for biogas and biomethane. We are finishing now. I have a final question for Renato. We have a question here that is, I'm trying to summarize many questions regarding what Brazilian policy really means and how can we use these principles to guide us. Could trade barriers be assumed as subsidy? What's happening to our communication to other countries? What are we trying to do here? How can we interpret this?
Well, you can see that the reassessing fossil fuel subsidies is one of the 5 principles that the Biofuture platform is calling for. When it comes to trade barriers, it depends on the definitions of what a trade barrier is, but I think we have to understand, and speaking not only as chair of the Biofuture platform, but also as someone that has closely been following biofuels policies around the world from my standpoint in the ministry. The bioenergy, biofuels policies, they have a lot of drivers. So climate change is a very important one, but it's not the only one. So the political drivers that make countries implement the policies. So I just said that it is a policy-driven sector. So the drivers are many, and they also relate to adding value to local agriculture, to generating jobs, to promoting rural development, and to promote some level of import substitution from oil and oil-derived products. So And I would say that this is unfortunate, but it's a reality that bioenergy policies many times in many different countries, they go along some kind of barriers to trade, be they tariff or non-tariff barriers, or just regular WTO most favored nation tariffs, which are not a barrier per se in the WTO sense, but still there is an obstacle to free trade. While you can see that oil has free access everywhere, so no, I don't know of any country imposing import tariffs on oil. So people can hear that and even laugh at the idea, so uncommon that it would be. But this, despite being a better fuel for all the environment, biofuels do still face these kinds of blocks. And I think we just have to assume it is part of the reality, it's part of the political reality in countries that the drivers are several. And in this case, to some extent, the priority has to be the policies that create the markets, the policies that create the local production, local industry, and they mobilize the different drivers that make countries have those programs. And in a second stage, once the markets are ready, once the industries are ready, we do believe, and we have seen this happening, that then the trade will happen to equalize seasonal imbalances, to equalize deficiency. So we need really to be patient about this and set as a priority the development of markets and local production and the policies, the mandates, and international trade is desirable. It increases efficiency. And it would naturally happen once these steps are combined. So, considering for each country's realities.
Okay, Renato, thank you very much. I would like to finish with a word from Plinio. Professor Brito already talked about this, but we have some questions here that I think Plinio could address to finish. As many African countries are still at an embryonic stage of biofuel development with limited expertise and finance, and I think this would be applying to other countries, other emerging markets. Are there key lessons that can be learned from Brazil's experience right now?
Thank you very much, Professor Glaucia. Before I close in with these final remarks, I would like to congratulate Professor Brito, Councillor Renato Godinho, all the organizers of this webinar, Professor Horta, Dr. Cantarella, and for this key question. From our experience, what I can say is that, yes, Professor Brito, probably Africa is the region in the world, besides India and China and Southeast Asia, and a few other countries in Latin America and Central America, a key region where biofuels and bioenergy production can evolve. And why it's not evolving as swiftly? Essentially because they still have not understood the potential that bioenergy and biofuels represent for their own economies, their own energy independence, their air pollution reduction impact, health impact. And once they realize all these impacts, and as governments realize, they will understand the importance of policies, long-term policies, which are needed because you need long-term policies for this to develop, consistent policies, which establish the necessary comfort for private investment to happen, creating the minimal needed regulation for the installment of production and use of biofuels. And as soon as they develop this, they will start realizing the various complementary benefits of these initiatives. Because it's not only about energy, it's not only about health, it's about a project of economic and social development. And we know that in Africa, one of the major causes of deforestation is the lack of income. People that deforest to produce and to obtain wood for cooking, and by bringing up an alternative which is consistent with the availability of factors of production in Africa, we will not aggravate the constraints in capital which already exist in the country. We would be contributing to building up capital accumulation in agriculture and in the economies in general. Bioenergy, biofuels may be the primary source of bringing sustainable energy production in many parts of the world. I mean, Ethiopia, Western Africa, all along Central Africa. All these countries they have precipitation, they have labor. What they need to develop is organization and policies to utilize better all this huge potential, which I'm certain will be complementary between energy, agriculture, and food agriculture, agriculture for food purposes as well. Thank you very much, and I congratulate and thank the organizers, my colleagues in this panel, and you particularly, Professor Glaucia, for moderating this event.
Well, thank you, Plinio, Renato, Brito. I want to finish by saying this is a very important moment that we have in Brazil. We have an agenda that is being implemented very seriously in many levels in Brazil. We're caught in this COVID moment, but we are reorganizing and we are trying to see how to reset our economies in a better way than even before. And I have to mention that it's amazing how much we can find towards this goal in science and technology in Brazil. We have many different institutions organizing research efforts towards a bioeconomy. It's a sizzling effort. We can see many different opportunities here, and I think BBEST and Biofuture agenda for our upcoming events is going to address all of these opportunities. So I'm very happy to close this webinar and thank all the participants, our sponsors, our organizers, especially the background, the backstage help that we have, Horta Nogueira and Clarissa Foretti. We are indebted to you towards having a good dialogue here with so many participants. We have plans to upload this webinar to BBEST-Biofuture YouTube channel. And please look forward to our communications of the next steps of the BBEST-Biofuture conference. Thank you all.
Thank you.